This playlist organizes and combines the sections of the second lecture on utilitarianism. This lecture focuses primarily on critical evaluation of the doctrine of utilitarianism in an attempt to determine its viability as a general theory of ethical choice. We'll start off, though, by reviewing the tenets of classical utilitarianism that we discussed last time. Then we'll turn our attention to three kinds of criticisms that have been forwarded by ethical theorists since the heyday of utilitarianism. Once we look at those criticisms, then we'll look at different ways that utilitarians might respond to these criticisms or modifications that they might make to utilitarianism in an attempt to negate the force of these criticisms. So the first kind of criticism that we'll look at questions whether or not happiness or pleasure is the only intrinsically valuable human goal, and even if it is, whether or not maximizing pleasure actually is tightly linked to the ethical status of an action. Next, we'll look at criticism that seeks to evaluate the notion that consequences are the sole source of the ethical status of a particular action. This particular version of the criticism will focus in on whether or not happiness or pleasure really is the only aspect of an action that influences or determines its ethical status, either praiseworthy or blameworthy. And we'll look at three versions of that criticism. The first version of that criticism suggests that many times, or at least on occasion, people can engage in acts that seem intuitively or from a common sense perspective to be patently unjust, but that nevertheless maximize the greatest good for the greatest number, and thereby look to have a high ethical praiseworthiness within the context of utilitarianism. The second version that we'll look at looks at actions that seem to violate the rights of individuals, but that result in increased happiness. And again, the question posed is maximizing happiness, is creating this particular kind of consequence sufficient to make those actions morally praiseworthy, ethically correct, even when intuitively or from a common sense perspective, they blatantly violate the rights of individuals. And finally, we'll look at criticisms that question whether or not the consequences of an action at a particular time are the sole determinants of its ethical status if conditions in the past, such as decisions that we've made, obligations that we've undertaken, promises that we've made, duties that we've accepted, can be overridden by considerations in the present moment. In other words, does focusing on the current consequences and ignoring past preconditions pick out actions as morally praiseworthy that seem from a common sense or intuitive perspective to be morally ambiguous or blameworthy. Finally, we'll look at two versions of objections to utilitarianism that question whether or not the mechanism of equal consideration that's built into utilitarianism, this idea of impartial calculation of greatest happiness, really is an appropriate way to accomplish the minimum criterion for morality that Rachel talks about, this idea of equal consideration of people's interests. So we'll look at two kinds of cases. Cases where utilitarianism, because it doesn't differentiate between, for instance, our own happiness and the happiness of everyone else, seems to create enormous obligations on us to defer our own life goals and happiness in favor of the promotion of other people's happiness in ways that just seem morally supererogatory, excessive in nature. Then we'll look at other versions of this objection that suggest that by considering everyone's happiness equally, it leads us to devalue the importance that we associate with our close social connections with each other, the kind of partiality that we have for the happiness of our friends and our family that seems morally appropriate to value over the happiness of strangers or people we've never met. Once we've looked at these criticisms, then we'll go back and look at the sorts of responses that utilitarians might make, and then we'll talk about Rachel's overall assessment of utilitarianism in light of the criticisms and possible responses. So recall that on page 13 of Utilitarianism, Mill articulates the utilitarian principle, which he calls the greatest happiness principle. And he says the greatest happiness principle holds that actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, and wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. By happiness is intended pleasure in the absence of pain, and by unhappiness, pain in the privation of pleasure. So there's our utilitarian principle. This is the sole determinant of the ethical status of a particular action. Furthermore, right, while, for instance, Bentham seemed to emphasize pleasure in the sense of sensory or, in a derogatory way, animal pleasure, as equated with happiness, that a lot of theorists think that mere sensory or physical pleasure is really an unworthy goal, and that, in fact, pursuing pleasure oftentimes leads us to do things that undermine our own well-being. So, for instance, smokers derive pleasure from smoking cigarettes because it soothes their withdrawal symptoms from addiction. But it also continues to feed their addiction, and it causes them to be exposed to carcinogens and to engage in activities that undermine their overall cardiovascular health. And we noted that Mill has a wider or qualitative notion of pleasure that he equates with happiness that includes what he calls higher level pleasures, pleasures that are more unique to human beings than to mere animals. And so he claims that the exercise of the intellect, of the imagination, feelings of social connection, of moral sentiments, all of these things create pleasure for us in ways that are of higher value to us than, say, the euphoria that we get from smoking opium. And so in order to be truly happy, Mill argues, we have to satisfy these higher pleasures, these non-sensual pleasures. And of course, he evaluates an action's ethical standings by its actual consequences, not its merely possible or its likely consequences. Similarly, the only happiness or unhappiness that matters is the happiness or unhappiness that results directly from the act affecting the immediate people, and no other features of the act or its further effects are relevant to its ethical status. Actions that promote the greatest good for the greatest number of persons achieve the highest ethical status. They're good, they're praiseworthy, etc. And actions that fail to do this achieve lower ethical status for Mill. And finally, the moral or ethical rightness of actions depends only on that some good consequences for all the people or sentient beings, and it's added together, happiness, positive, unhappiness, negative, to get this summation of the net happiness where each individual's contribution is weighted equally so that there is no preference of one person's happiness over another. No one has a higher valuation in terms of their actual affected outcome from an action than any other individual.